Hi, I'm Emerson Fox, and welcome to my presentation, Criminal Minds. I'll be talking about nature versus nurture, brain scans, and profiling, all to answer the age old question of why. I've always been interested in the psychology behind serial killers and how they're able to do what they do, so this is just a deep dive into that. I'll also be comparing serial killer brain scans to regular everyday people. But first, what is a serial killer? This is someone who murders three or more people with a cooling off period in between. And normally these murders are done in very similar ways. First, nature versus nurture. I found that they're natural born potential killers because genes and brain abnormalities could potentially make you a killer. However, your childhood could prevent it or turn you into one. Serial killers have a lot of abnormal brain structures that are created through a complex combination of born with it and lived experiences. Some of these lived experiences are traumatic head injuries, such as a car crash, but born with it, there's psychosis and psychopathy. Psychosis is a complete loss of your sense of reality, which is semi permanent. Psychopathy, on the other hand, is a personality disorder, which makes it a lot more permanent because it's a chemical and genetic defect in your brain, which leaves you with a complete lack of empathy. Some genetics is the MAOA gene, which predisposes a person to aggression and violence. This is stronger in men because it's found on the X chromosome, and women have two, which it almost always cancels out. This gene is also responsible for making a protein that breaks down certain types of chemical messengers, such as dopamine and serotonin, linked to mood. And serial killers, in my research later on, have all this gene defect, and around 30% of men in everyday life have this gene. So, environment. When we talk about environment, we're talking about your family, upbringing, and the impact it has on you later on in life. A traumatic event almost always increases the risk of serial killer tendencies because it can cause or resurface mental illness. Ted Bundy was a great example of this because he was lied to by his mother about who his father was. Then he made it his mission to embarrass and degrade women. Abby Morano linked types of abuse to typologies, and all throughout the abuse, she linked rape and lust to every single one. Sexual abuse was also linked to anger typologies with overkill and postmortem sex. Psychological abuse was linked to financial gain, which involved torture, and physical childhood abuse was only linked to rape and lust, with behaviors such as carrying out the act very quickly. So nature versus nurture, it's a mixture of both. Murders can be both born and made. Next, brain scans and case studies. I first looked into James Fallon because he has a very big and important role in the research of neurocriminology. Fallon has scanned the brains of dozens of people believed to be psychopaths looking for a pattern, in which he found it. He found that there's reduced activity in the orbital cortex thought to play a role in regulating our emotions and impulses, and less activity in the lower frontal lobe. The prefrontal cortex is also very important because psychopaths have reduced connections between the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for empathy and guilt, and the amygdala, which mediates fear and anxiety. Reduced functioning can also result in a loss of control over older subcortical structures, such as the amygdala, which are thought to give a rise to aggressive feelings. Damage has also been linked with risk-taking, irresponsibility, rule-breaking, and outbursts, which predispose a person to violent criminal acts. These can all help us understand the why behind they're able to do what they do without any guilt. Other unusual functioning was also found in the amygdala, hippocampus, and thalamus. Murderers tended to show relatively lower activation in the structures in the left hemisphere, but higher in the right hemisphere. And researchers aren't quite sure about this yet, but there's a lot more to learn. The first case study I want to look at is Dr. Helen Morrison. She studied and interviewed 135 serial killers and believes a chromosome abnormality to be the trigger. She also found that there are low orbital cortex activity in all serial killers, which is involved with ethical behavior, decision-making, and impulse control. This also leads to less normal suppression of behaviors such as violence and drinking. Many of the brain differences I've talked about can be measured early on in life. Criminologist Natalie Fontaine linked the tendency toward being callous and unemotional in children between 7 and 12 to the higher risk of becoming psychopaths as adults. However, these traits aren't fixed, and they can be changed as children grow. But it raises the question of, is it ethical to scan the brains of young children to find the at-risk ones when they haven't even done anything wrong? The last case study I want to look at is brain imaging data from 108 incarcerated male adults. They were categorized into 3 groups: homicidal subjects, violent but non-homicidal subjects, and minimally violent subjects. There was little difference between the less violent subjects. However, there was a significant gray matter reductions in several brain areas that distinguish homicide offenders from other kinds of criminals. So, gray versus white matter. Gray matter conducts, processes, and sends information all throughout the body, whereas white matter interprets sensory information from various parts of the body. And lastly, profiling. Profiling is the basic premise that behavior reflects personality. The main profile is the psychological one. It's where there's an absence of physical evidence or eyewitness testimonies, and they take what they know about the unknown suspects and his actions and crimes and try to generate additional information. They're not always 100% accurate and sometimes can be vague, but they help investigators examine evidence from crime scenes and victim witness reports to develop an offender description. There are 3 different types of offenders: organized, disorganized, and mixed. Organized show evidence of planning with better intelligence, and they tend to target specific victims. They also bring the tools that they need to access and control the victim, and they avoid leaving any evidence behind. Disorganized usually live alone. They're lower intelligence and often have mental illnesses. They don't plan ahead or bring tools, but they use whatever is handy and exert little effort to avoid leaving any evidence behind. A mixed offender is mixed between organized and disorganized. They show evidence of planning and a sophisticated MO, but it might be messy, which indicate some control over deep-seated and violent fantasies. Lastly, stages in a profiling investigation. Profiling inputs is number 1. You collect any evidence which could provide insight into the what, where, how, and why. This can be anything from a fingerprint to a blood splatter. Step 2, decision processing. This is an attempt to match different aspects of a crime with a manual of classifications by the FBI. And if a specific situation fits enough criteria, the offender receives that classification, often leading to multidimensional understanding of the criminal and their brain. Step 3, crime assessment. This is an attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events from beginning to after the crime, preferably from both the victim and the perpetrator. Step 4, the criminal profile. This is where we actually generate the profile, often including the suspect's gender, age, race, occupational skills, IQ, social interests, mental health status, and family background, and a lot more. And number 5, lastly, it's criminal investigative use. This is where the profile can be used both before and after the arrest of a suspect, where it's available to help narrow down a suspect pool, but can be used to extract information and ideally a confession. Thank you so much for listening, and here are all my sources.